This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt. Good morning, Connell.
Morning, lads. You're there on your computers.
Yep.
Cheating.
Cheating.
Have you got ChatGPT poised there to answer all our listeners'
Matt,
questions?
Connell might be as smart as you, but I'm not. Let me assure you. So I need all the help I can get. So
yeah. I've got my laptop here because I've got to stay on top of Matt because he's going to.
I've got a scrap of
stuff
paper
on
with
us.
with a few notes on it.
He's read so many books during the week that he'll pull stuff out.
Come on, Stu, get us on track before everyone presses stop.
Well, listeners, welcome, Thrive Perspectives. We are going to continue, as we always do, our conversation around the Christian worldview. And today we're going to, I think, take a really interesting path, and we're going to answer the question, or hopefully position an answer to the question, what everyone knows about God. And what we're going to look for is, what is it that everyone can know about God's existence outside of personal revelation or the Bible? In other words, what, Matt, you would call general revelation. What is it that everyone can know about God without us having to have that sort of special revelation or biblical revelation?
And the point of that is that it enables us to recognize the fact that there's so much truth that is generally accessible to people, and I think it prevents us as Christians, and I think this might be a caricature, but there can be a tendency for Christians to feel like everything in every other religion or philosophy is wrong, which I think is a really problematic attitude. Well, first of all, it's not even right. It's not even biblical. Paul, in Acts 17, when he goes to Athens, he commends them for all the things that they believe that are right. Essentially, he agrees with a lot of things he quotes from their philosophers, and then he proclaims Jesus into that context. So Jesus is the unique revelation. So there's something absolutely crucial there. But it's amazing how much is generally, in reading different religious texts, I often find myself largely in agreement. Reading, for example, the Hindu Upanishads. People might think, oh man, you get it's all it's all lies, and no. Actually, I found myself agreeing with a lot that was there. I fundamentally disagree with their description of the way of salvation. There's a lot of truth there. I recently read the Tao Te Ching, which is the one of the main scriptures of the Chinese Taoist religion. And man, I found a lot of it profound and even actually quite edifying. Right now, again, as a way of salvation, and it's this problematic in terms of the, essentially the worship of ancestors. And so, of course, there are elements there that are problematic. But I'm constantly, and I would say, encouraged by the sense in which so much is available to everyone. And I think it's a good missional principle, rather than to go into a situation looking to disagree with people. Look to find areas that you can agree with. It's like, there's a bank that I can build a bridge to. And in fact, I think that is a sound missiological principle. I've heard missionaries, talk about this. You go in, you find out what are the points of agreement, and you'll find lots of things. And essentially, you'll find that there are a lot of things that will help those people make sense of Jesus, right? A lot of things already built into that. And that, of course, is what you see in Acts chapter 17.
Connell, did you have an opening sort of positioning?
There's probably nothing else to say after that superb.
That's right.
That superb introduction. Connell, you're just sitting there speechless, aren't you? It's just.
I haven't read the Tao. I haven't read the Tao. I'm sorry, Matt.
But you suggested this this subject.
I did because the Bible's under so much attack. In this age, it's all called into question. Whether we can actually believe what the Bible says. And it's as if everything that we believe about God is just because the Bible says so. And I think what general revelation brings to us is says, well, what about our experience of reality itself and nature and creation and how we live our lives? Even if we set the Bible aside, is our belief in not just God, but in the Christian version of God, the narrative that we have, our doctrines and theology, is it actually reasonable just in the context of reality and how we live our lives? And then does that sync up with what we've got in our special revelation, which is what's revealed in the Bible? And I think, in my thinking about it, I'm surprised at how well they match up. They, there's obviously other religions and different flavors of how things work and what this divine consciousness or whatever in the universe is. And Christianity has a special revelation to try to put some sort of framework and around how to think of it, some doctrine and so on. But when you actually think about it,
which itself is reasonable.
Yeah,
that if there is a God and if that God has personal and we have some relationship to that God, and in a personal sense, surely we can expect communication, as you said.
That's right. Yeah. And so this is what I want to try to unpack, because in going through this myself, it kind of leads you to think, actually, we've already established in our earlier discussions about the reasonableness of there being some sort of divine consciousness in the universe. We talked about people like Dr. Ian McGilchrist leading the way about talking about the right and left brain hemispheres. And one of the things listening to McGilchrist talking about it is when he's actually pressed on the point of what do you think is the divine consciousness in the universe, he steps right back and kind of really goes, I don't know. I wouldn't want to put any kind of definition around that.
Which is very common, and that's in fact in Taoism, that's the same. It's there, but you can't sort of talk about it. And it's essentially, in Acts 17, it's what Paul says, because he talks about the unknown God in a sense.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because he sees that act of then trying to put some definition around what that God could be as kind of taking that right brain knowledge and moving it across the left brain and trying to break it down into its which is in a way what doctrine kind of is. We're trying to put some understanding around it in language that we can understand. And
he's resistant to, see, this is the interesting thing. He resists that because he says as soon as you start putting language around it, you create limitations and which goes against the nature of who God is. And that's an interesting point. In fact, and this is just because I'm using Taoism because it's fresh in my head because I've just been reading through this, but for the same reason, it's, they resist putting language around the Tao, which is essentially the divine principle in the universe. Yeah. Because as soon as you do that, you create limitations. Now, one of the things that discounts though is any ability to communicate. Like language is something that we have that facilitates relationship. And the problem with McGilchrist's point, and I would say the problem in Taoism, and we're running ahead here a little bit, is that it discounts any ability to talk about God to each other. Like if we can't say anything and or even to communicate with God. And so it essentially depersonalizes. And again, this is where you get this very distant sort of unknown.
McGilchrist is sympathetic. He does go as far as to say he's quite sympathetic to the Christian understanding, and it probably is more truth in that, which is interesting. But that's the biggest concession I think he's prepared to make there. But I think if we do go there, and let's try to put some sort of framework around that thinking, if you do go there, what do you end up with? Do you end up with another religion besides Christianity? Or if you follow that logically through, just using that kind of general revelation and what we know about how we relate to each other and what we see in life and reality, if we follow that through logically, how close do we get back to what lines up with that special revelation that's in the Bible? Because I found it actually surprisingly, the biblical explanation seems to be the best fit for reality as we know it.
So let me throw the cat among the pigeons, because in conversations I've had around this stuff with people in the past, the objection I guess I feel I get from that is like, well, yeah, because people are writing in these books, the Tao and the Bible, what they've observed, what is reality. So of course, if it's a commentary on what we experience, then of course it's going to line up with what we experience. So,
It's also written to control or to gain influence. So many religious texts could be, well, that'd be the argument against Christianity, for example. So it wouldn't all just be, this is what and human experience is problematic. We know that we can't. Yeah. We're told in the Bible to test everything, and even though things seem reasonable and even good, we've got to test them. That's our benchmark is the Bible and what's been revealed to us. So it's like, it's not what anything that goes or what we think or feel what reality is either. So
yeah, I think we need to remember too, the Bible, and of course the Bible is a collection of books, not just one book. As a collection of books, its purpose is not just to describe reality, but to give us access to a relationship with God. Yeah. So, the truth of the Bible is largely about what I would refer to as the efficacy of Scripture, that this really transforms lives for, and it does draw people into a relationship with God, which we would all say is absolutely true. Absolutely. But to go back to what you were saying before, in most cases with beliefs about ultimate reality, whether we call them religious or metaphysical beliefs, they haven't been built up from the ground level rationally. I mean, that idea of building beliefs up rationally really only begins in sort of about 500 BC. With the beginnings of Greek philosophy, and that's quite radical at the time. And it's interesting now that idea is. I mean, there's increasing criticism of that idea that we just, we're a blank slate and we build things up rationally. And I think it's much more reasonable to assume that there are a whole lot of things that we know, and this is a word that we've used in past episodes, tacitly. In other words, we actually know things more than we can say. We intuit them, perhaps. There's a sort of a sense in which we intuit truth, or perhaps to put it differently, innately. There are things that innately we know. Now, there's some reason to believe that, biblically, that there is room for the idea of innate beliefs. Paul in Romans chapter 2 talks about the Gentiles doing by nature the things required of the law because it's written on their hearts. Yeah. Now that's a way of talking about innate knowledge. And by innate knowledge, it's the stuff that you're born with. It's why, a 3-year-old kid will say that's not fair because there's an innate sense of justice, But there are also things that we intuit about the world around us. So yeah, it's not always about building things up rationally. I think almost particularly in the modern era, there's since the Enlightenment, there's been too much emphasis on this idea of building things up rationally from the ground up. A lot of philosophers, and this is probably true of someone that we mentioned in the last episode, Michael Polanyi, who in the modern era have discussed knowledge and have said that's actually not how that building things up from the ground level, like sort of Descartes saying, how do I know that the external world is real, and coming up with a rational argument, as to how I can accept that all of this is real. I mean, that's not how it works. I mean, in the 20th century, a number of influential philosophers like Polanyi and Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, was the same, just put up their hand and said, that's actually not true to how we know things. You know what I mean? And so there's a sense in which as human beings, we find ourselves in the world and we find ourselves knowing certain things more than even we can say, intuiting things perhaps, and believing things innately. And I guess what we want to talk about, what are those things? And I think that's probably what gives rise, I would say, to a lot of to these religious beliefs that come through, the meditation and reflection and contemplation, and a lot of what, for example, the writers of the Upanishads, the Hindu, the more philosophical section of the Hindu scriptures come up with, is what I would describe as almost like a bottom-up view. It's like viewing things, but from a human perspective, and inferring certain things. So there is, rationality is involved. So they're inferring the fact that certain beliefs about what happens to us when we die, and the idea that we dissolve into like we're part of Brahman, which is this sort of universal God. And when we die, we dissolve into Brahman, which, they practice reincarnation and spread the ashes, and you become one again with nature. And if you recognize a sort of divine principle within nature, it seems reasonable from there to induce the idea, well, maybe everything is God, and so that seems rational. So this is where I think we've got to be careful what we do with reason, because, there are a lot of things that are true but are quite paradoxical. And so I think we've got to also acknowledge the limits of reason, because a lot of, religious beliefs, go in terms of rational induction. Mm-hmm. Even what happens in, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, you'd have to agree, man, they've really, that's really good reasoning, but they end up with things that I don't believe to be the case,
And I think in terms of being rational, I don't necessarily agree that we have to sort of ditch being rational. I think there's different resolutions of rationality. So like in scientific rationalism, we understand everything step by step, but you can zoom out from that, and there are can be some key principles that are reasonable and rational to hold on to, but you don't know how it works, and you're not going to try to understand how it works.
Yeah.
But as kind of from a higher level, they're rational ideas, and I think we can zoom right out and hold on to rational ideas that infer other ideas, but allowing there to be room within that, accepting that there's going to be things that are beyond our rational mind. But I think there are rational, I'm thinking sort of markers along the journey that they're rational, we're not just going to abandon rationality, but there are rational kind of markers that we can navigate between without necessarily saying we have to therefore break it down and understand all of the steps between it. And I think that's to me is the difference, not demanding all the answers, but just trying to find those kind of big kind of ideas that I can kind of hang on to.
Yeah. I'd say as well, I think there is that tacit, that eternity in their hearts you talked about, life after death. And it's interesting.
Which was a classic book.
It's interesting to me that, exactly. It's interesting to me that currently, under current research, I just looked it up, 61% of the population of the world, recent research, believe in life after death. They can't explain it. It's just, they can't, they're not religious necessarily. Some of them will be, obviously, but they're not all religious. So there's a sense of something in us that says there must be more than this. But we can
let's go through some of these things, because I think the question is, in a sense, what everyone knows, and by saying that we mean what is generally like human beings, people groups, and what. Yeah. Because it is interesting to note that across people groups, and this is the topic of Mircea Eliade's book, a philosopher of religion, is now deceased, but wrote a book called The Sacred and the Profane, and he looks particularly at primitive religions and looks at the things in common. And one of the key things is this other dimension, this sense of a spiritual dimension. And with that, a dimension of the sacred. There are some things that are sacred. And in order to, the word sacred gets thrown around in our culture often sort of a little too blithely. It's, because the sacred requires this other dimension that makes certain things sacred, Yeah. And so this idea of a spiritual dimension as opposed to this sort of very closed world materialism, we've talked a lot about that before. That materialist mechanistic worldview, it has been a splash in the pan in sort of the modern period from roughly the time of, Newton up until Einstein, and now it's gone again. It's so materialism as a worldview that the universe is a big machine is come and gone, and so. The idea that there is this spiritual dimension is sort of the basic. All human beings have had that spiritual intuition, and with that, the sense that we also ourselves have a spiritual aspect to our being. That we're not just biological organisms or machines or whatever metaphor you might want to use. In fact, in most cultures, the division between what we now know as the natural and the supernatural, that division is a very recent one, and it isn't generally made in most cultures. And I think even now, with where science has gone, the line between natural and supernatural again is blurred out of sight, particularly with, quantum field theory and all of this sort of stuff, because now we know the universe isn't just a big machine, right? It's much weirder than that. So, there was always this sense that, the spiritual and the physical are like, and we've used the illustration before, like just that there are more dimensions to reality. It's like it's reality in 4 dimensions, and let's just, and I'm speaking metaphorically, that there's this other dimension, and all people groups everywhere have always just accepted that. And I think children know that, that. I think it's just intuitive and innate in human beings to believe that.
And what I mean by being rational is it's rational because it's actually how we live our lives. Because an example is, I used to work with a guy, he was an atheist, and we're talking about life insurance. I think I was organising my life insurance and working out, how much to insure for and stuff, and making sure I provided for family if something happened to me and I was no longer here. And his view was that I'm not taking life insurance out because if I'm dead, I'm not even going to care what happens to my family. It sounds really bad, but when you think about it, when he dies, he just returns back to being dust in the ground. His family just becomes just like anyone else's family. Like, I don't take life insurance out for someone else's family. Like, I cease to exist. And actually everything that I've ever lived for, everything that was of value to me now is actually not. It's like I return to a state of everything I've worked for being worthless. He was an honest atheist, at least, because he could see that that's what he believes in. And it's really stark. It was a really kind of stark representation of that reality. But I think we all live.
Atheists wouldn't agree with that.
No,
they don't, but they should. I think they should. We all live.
You mean to be consistent?
Yeah, to be consistent.
Yeah, why care about it? Anyway, but we
don't want to get into that. Don't want to get.
I think just to pick up, because we're throwing the word rationality around a lot, and I'm just conscious of there's a question here: what counts as rational, really? And actually, there's an approach to this that would include innate knowledge as part of what counts as being rational. The thing is, we reason from a premise. We always reason from something to something. But the premise from which I know it's getting a little technical here, but the premise that we reason from is it cannot itself be established through reason. So everyone reasons from certain premises. Those premises themselves cannot be rationally verified in a sense. And this has been now abundantly pointed out. So there are things that are, in a sense, basic or so fundamental. And reason is just is like a process of, inducing from certain things that we take for granted. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so what we're talking about here, I think, are what are the basic things that sort of underlie, that are part of human intuition. And I would suggest that essentially the spirituality or this spiritual, the multi-dimensional view of reality is absolutely built into what it means is that I can say, I am reasonable to believe that without having to present evidence for it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that is essentially, it's rational to believe something because it's so basic, it's so fundamental to who we are that we reason from that, not to it. I mean, it's interesting. There are arguments for this, and in a future episode, we'll talk about near-death experiences.
Yes,
and there's now all of this research in a recent book that's come out by Bruce Grayson called After, which is more or less saying we now cannot rule out the fact that, he would say the evidence is compelling that we exist apart from our bodies. Absolutely compelling. We've ruled out all of the possible explanations based on near-death experiences and what people experience. And so in a sense, you could say, Bruce Grayson is saying I've gone on this journey, and I now consider this scientific proof for the existence of what might be called a soul or something like that.
And I think that's a really great example of what we're trying to do in this episode and probably another couple of episodes, because essentially we all kind of go, well, we knew that. So essentially
that's right,
he's worked back to proving what we already innately, tacitly knew to be true, but couldn't. And he's tried to go and say, well, I feel like we've actually, as much as we can, with
innate knowledge too. It's not proof. I think we all live with an innate sense of sacredness of life and value in life, in even the environment and the created world, and we all live as if it is that way. So I think it's reasonable and therefore probably rational to say that there is some sense of value in creation. Now, it could also be
inherent value, as opposed to instrumental value.
So, but it could also be that we're just, if you take a naturalist view, it's just evolution and it's just part of the chemicals in our brain that makes us. And that I understand that can be a position, but all of those ideas then have other logical consequences. And I think when you sort of thread them all together, so we're not proving one or the other, but if we take one of them as a as a position, as one of those kind of road markers in our journey, and then we travel to the next one, that points to the next one, to the next one, to the next one.
Yeah.
It constructs a kind
that's
of
right.
a web
but you're
of
starting from something as well.
Yes.
And to use that example, I think we experience value at the most fundamental sense as we live in our world and we see that the world around us, the creation, the natural world, let's call it that, there is a sense that it has absolute inherent value. It's not just, because I like it personally. There is some things are absolutely not right. There's a sense that there's absolutely that's it's not just because it's not just me saying yuck. It's not just what in ethics you call emotional. It's not just my emotional response. No, there's a sense that this is absolutely not right, which means that there's something that's absolutely good, And so from that sense of the existence of absolute value, absolute, sense of good and evil, then, of course, then we can try to work out from there, well, what is actually good and what is evil and so forth.
Yeah.
And then you get, it's interesting to note how pervasive the idea is, do unto others as you would have them do to you. I come across that because, again, I would say that then is assuming that there's something about you that connects with something in me, that we are. Well, I would say there's something sacred about human beings. There is value to human life, not just to my life. It's not just, well, I just value my life and you're of no value. No, there's something of absolute value, not just about the world, but I think in particular about human beings. And I think in all cultures, there is this sense of, how we treat each other and really matters.
It's a fundamental kind of idea of value, because even if that person was in a coma for the rest of their life, we'd still treat them as if they've got value, even though they've lost all of their abilities to kind of.
Well, that possibly could differ between cultures.
But I still think
things can get lost, though. This is the thing in cultures, overlays of beliefs. For example, like the common practice of the exposure of infants with disabilities. That we're going to basically or I'm going to sacrifice my children to the god Molech or something, as in in the Phoenician ancient Phoenician religion. That is an overlay of something. Now, the idea there is that I've got to in some ways make myself right with God or the gods. It comes from an intuition that is basically sound, but it's then distorted and distorted and distorted, and you end up with child sacrifice. So there's overlays, of course, that are.
Matt, would you say, though, we're talking a lot about the sacred value of human life, and you used the example of a coma, for instance, but I just wonder, in the ancient world, it seemed much more to me about survival of the fittest and the tribal kind of, and I don't care about those guys. It's like the best guy wins. It seemed to me that when Jesus came, that was where a lot of that stuff was turned up up the other way? Do you think there was the do unto others as you'd have them do unto them, way back in those days where people were just slaughtering each other and the guy with the biggest sword wins? I mean,
well, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you do get it in reflected religious belief, and maybe it's more a result of reflection than. Although I think the intuition is there, but this is where there's an overlay, because remember, according to the biblical story, and this actually is what is unique about the Christian faith, is there's a narrative understanding of reality that we have fallen from something.
Yes.
Right? Now, I mean, the idea of a fall is not unique to, Christianity, but that's a very important aspect, so that the way that things are is not necessarily the way that things are meant to be. And so the idea of, the survival of the fittest in the sort of dog eat dog world. Yes, it is there. And in Plato's Republic, there's a discussion around what is justice. And one of the characters, because it's written in dialogue form, seriously suggests, and this was quite a common view in the ancient world, that justice is merely the will of the strongest person.
Yeah.
Right. And that was a serious view of justice. Of course, Plato is arguing that no, that's not what it is. And I may say Plato's response to that is equally problematic. Essentially, he comes up with a caste system.
Right.
Like he reasons to a caste system that, everyone is born at a particular level, right? And you've just got to sort of fulfill the duty at that level, which is the same as in essentially the caste system in Hinduism.
Yeah.
And that's deducing from the way that things are in another sense. You know what I mean? Because we see that, okay, different people have different abilities. And so therefore the idea, for example, of equality is rare. And certainly in the ancient world, no one really thought that people were inherently equal.
Cool, yeah.
However, that probably emerges, arguably post sort of Neolithic revolution, when society was sort of restructured. You do get a caste system, because a lot of people point out that in essentially Paleolithic cultures or cultures that up until recently still lived at a Paleolithic level, were quite egalitarian, were naturally very egalitarian.
Right.
Although that's within that particular tribe. You know what I mean? I mean, you still get the same elements of the same problem, but we layer, human civilization in different ways has layered problems on top. And this is where what you're saying, what you said before, Connell, you get, religions as tools of, and this is the Marxist critique, essentially, religions become tools of the control and oppression.
Yeah.
And it's, undeniably that has often been the case, but it can only do that because it's instrumentalizing and appealing to things that we hold to be innately true. So just because religion is misused, it doesn't mean that it's inherently
that's right.
based on something false.
Yeah.
I mean, this is militant atheists. It's one of the almost sort of rhetorical tricks of militant atheists is share lots of anecdotes of religion as a tool of abuse, right? And then to say, so therefore there is no God. No, that's just human beings.
Or look at all the wars in the world. They're all over religion.
All religious war. Right. Okay. Well, that can only be the case. The abuse of religion can only exist because there actually is something within us that
says that that's wrong.
That says that that's, well, first of all, it says that's wrong, but also this sense within us that there is this spiritual aspect to existence, and even that we need some guidance in that. Now, human beings, again, we've made a fine art taking something good and wrecking it.
Yeah.
But there has to be something true to twist, and this gets back to what we're talking about. The nature of deception is such that it takes a truth and it twists it, right? And so there has to be something, some innate or tacit understanding there in the first place to actually twist.
And also, don't forget, when we look back at the story of history, it looks very dark and bleak, but it probably wasn't quite like that, because they recorded the big events, especially the human trauma and the wars and the suffering and the oppression. Often there would be hundreds of years between those events, but when collapsed into history,
it looks like it was.
It looks like it. So you could misinterpret that as being as if the world was inherently more evil, and now gradually we're moving into, the sun starts to shine now, and we've all this peacetime, and
which is a commonly held
rights and so on. And I think I would try to resist that a little bit, because I kind of think I'm just reading the story of history sort of collapsed down into.
We're just getting better at repressing our issues.
Well, in fact, now we may actually be worse, even though we've got stronger justice systems and things like, human rights enshrined in law and things like that. It's hard to tell whether we're better for that as compared to history, when things looked, terrible, when there was no real enshrined rights and strong legal systems, and you had kings just coming in and chopping people's heads off just because they were in his, and so on. So it's just, I'm just not sure that, I'm not sure that's a good picture of reality either.
Yeah, well, so, and this probably brings us to the next thing. So as well as this basic intuition of this other, this other dimension, certainly there is the intuition, and this is pervasive, a universal intuition, some form of God, right? And this is actually a point that Mircea Eliade talks about in primitive cultures, is that there is this sense of God, but also this sense that somehow this God is withdrawn, and so the interaction tends to be with intermediary spirits. It could be the spirits of ancestors or localized spirits, or this is where you get the gods of the ancient world. This sense that there are localized spirits that we need to in some ways interact with. Now, that's actually not completely wrong. I mean, that again, there is, and we've discussed this to some extent in the past. We do believe in the existence of spiritual beings, even territorial spiritual beings, and there's a sense even in Scripture that God has given over the nations of the world to these spiritual beings to be kept in some kind of, albeit bad order, but order nevertheless, until we're set free from those. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But the point is that this idea of a general idea of God, and this is what you get, for example, in Hinduism, you get this idea of Brahman, but Brahman is so remote.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's not remote he's so pervasive, and here is where language runs out. In his infinite and eternal nature, he's almost, there's not much you can say about, like, even though he's immanent in all things. It's the same in, the Tao is the divine principle in all things. Well, it's just so great you can't really say anything about it. And so what you get in these religions is that therefore you drop to the next level, and we can only interact with these intermediary spirits. And that's quite a common thing. So this is Paul's the unknown God that he addresses with the Athenians. I mean, Plato's God is essentially a kind of unknown. Aristotle's God, essentially an unknown God out there. The God of many religions is essentially the ultimate God. Even religions that are polytheistic, there is this sense that there's something beyond that.
And even in current day, McGilchrist, who would we don't think's a Christian, he says, I don't know, but it's something out there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and as Eliade points out, in all of these religions, there's this sense that somehow that God is also sort of withdrawn, and there's intuition that also there's a problem, that there's some issue.
Why has that God?
There's some issue. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, our innate moral sensibility enables us to see that, okay, there's something wrong with us that puts us in some tension with this divine principle. And even in Taoism, this sense of, we're out of alignment with the Tao in some sense. However you want to put this, there is a sense of a problem. There's some problem. And so this is where you get the intuition to, in all these religions, to make sacrifices or to appease or to do. And it's when you get to the level of solutions to the problem, that's where you get the differences, and we're often very onerous differences, so there's all of this stuff we've got to do to try to make ourselves right or appease the gods, and it's often, the ideals can actually often be quite unreachable. And this is essentially where the uniqueness, and this is important, because all of those ideas, I think, are quite innate in people. And it actually, all of that is what makes sense of why we need Jesus in this equation, essentially. It's this basis of general revelation that there is a spiritual dimension, that there is a God, that there's some tension between us and God. All of that makes sense of why Jesus is absolutely crucial.
So I think there's something else I want to unpack, and I think we should do this next time, but we get into the whole monotheism versus polytheism. Like, is there one God or there are the multiple gods? The monotheistic religions of like Christianity versus the polytheistic religions of like Hinduism, for example. Because when you start to kind of look at what flows out of our intuition and the lot, and kind of how do we sort of reason from there, it's a starting point. Is there one God or are there multiple gods? And as you were saying there, Matt, I think even the polytheistic religions ultimately face this problem that they have to then appeal to some other ultimate unifying reality. But I kind of think I'd like to
which is true of Hinduism, by the way. Hinduism isn't strictly regarded as polytheistic. Hinduism is it's a kind of what you would describe as a monistic religion, is that everything is God.
Yeah.
They see Brahman as, Brahman is everything in a sense.
Yeah.
Everything is Brahman, and even the spiritual beings that they call God are part of Brahman, but they're, they coexist in the world at a higher level to us.
It's problematic for the polytheistic religions not to at some point be forced back to some sort of
that's right.
monotheistic. And I think that's a good starting point for our journey through this kind of discussion, is to go, well, then once we accept...
We're just starting? I thought we've been doing pretty well here today.
There's a fair bit to unpack
when
here,
you think when you look at what polytheism tries to solve and how that can be answered in monotheism, you actually end up with a different understanding of what we mean by even good and evil and where good and evil even comes from. Then that sort of flows into heading towards building up the biblical narrative.
It's interesting that Plato's argument against the gods in the Greek gods, and to the idea of observing religions of the gods, is that he said, well, all the gods, they're all fighting with each other, which is, and they've all got differences so we have to, and so he said, we have to go a step above that. I mean, it's not that he denies the existence of gods as such, but as you say, he's forced back to something more ultimate, which
is the same thing one of the Egyptian pharaohs did. He was tired of all the multi-god, and so he said, "No, we're just going to have one god, Ra." And that's it, because that'll sort that out.
But I think it does give us a confidence that there's something in Christianity. There's a truth that emerges when we think about those ideas and what they all mean, and sort of reason with it a little bit. There's a truth that emerges that helps us understand good and evil from a Christian perspective, and the explanatory power that actually has versus the polytheistic explanations for those things.
Let's pick that up in the next episode, Connell. I just want to come back and then we'll wrap up on this for now, to one other tacit knowledge I think that we have. So we've covered a sense of life after death. We've covered the sense of spirits. I think the other one is justice.
Yeah.
There's a sense of there's a price to pay for our mistakes. That's the reason a lot of these gods are invented. So there's a sense of there's
principle of sowing and reaping, which comes out in karma, and which again is pervasive. This sense that whatever we sow, we will reap. It's the intuition of. It's a very powerful thing, and I think this is the thing that brings us to the uniqueness of Christ. There is this intuition that we've all somehow got it wrong, and the solutions to that problem, they never really actually get people to that place of rest and reconciliation. And so this constant need
keep doing
for more and more kind of religious behavior. And essentially, and this is the thing that is unique about the Christian faith, it tells a story about the ultimate God, not one of the gods, but the ultimate God who becomes flesh to actually deal with that problem, to enable us to have a relationship with him. And, we can unpack the uniqueness of the Christian faith in the next episode. But I mean, this is the powerful message. This is why I think this message is so powerful, because it appeals to what is most intuitively urgent for most people. Now, the fact that God did that is very paradoxical, right? But in a sense, there is so much that we understand, that people understand, that can make sense of why we actually need that. But that essentially is what is unique about, I was talking recently with someone who is a Baha'i, said, I'm Baha'i, it's because we think all religions are, and I said, oh no, that's, I think that there's a great deal of truth in that. And we talked about all of the things. And when it really got down to it, the one thing that's needed, that was lacking is like, it's not enough just to sit around maybe knowing certain, they're like, so what if you know, actually, in order to be in a right relationship with this ultimate God that you speak about, we need to deal with this problem of how we have fallen short, this guilt. Well, this is what Jesus deals with. And I would add to that, in the light of beliefs in maybe the gods, there's a very strong sense also in the New Testament, I think we can forget this, of Jesus delivering us from the power of spiritual forces that essentially act as spiritual parasites on us. And so Jesus delivers us from guilt and from the spiritual forces of evil in the spiritual realm. And that is the unique thing about Christianity, and that's the core of the good news.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.